Hi, everyone. I'm Michael, and here with me is Sergio. We're really happy to be here at dotnet Conf for you. And we're going to be talking about MVVM building blocks for WinUI and WPF development. And so, as I said, I'm Michael A. Hawker, also known as the XAML Llama, thus the hat. I'm a senior software engineer at Microsoft and work on the Windows client platform. And with me is Sergio. Welcome, Sergio.
Thank you. Hi, folks. I'm Sergio Pedri. I'm a senior software engineer here at Microsoft. I'm the Microsoft Store client team, and I'm also the lead of the .NET Community Toolkit.
And so what we're going to talk about today, of course, we've introduced ourselves here. We're really excited to be here. And we're going to dive into what MVVM is all about, why you want to be using it, the tools that you can leverage to use that in your applications. And, hopefully if you're not familiar with MVVM, we'll kind of ramp you up to speed and really show you the practical uses of why the pattern is interesting and really it can help you build your applications. And if you are familiar with MVVM, hopefully we'll show you some tips and tricks here that just kind of are really useful to know and how to really best take advantage of this pattern that you may or may not be using in your applications already. So maybe it'll be a good refresher for you. And so we're going to spend bulk of our time actually just hands-on in Visual Studio in the code and diving in there and showing how we can use MVVM with both WPF and being able to reuse that code that we write in WinUI after as well. So let's just get started and start with what's MVVM about, Sergio? Why do we want to use it here?
Yeah, that's a good place to start. So MVVM is a software architecture pattern that you can use to structure your applications in such a way to make them much easier to maintain, to scale, and to test. So just to quickly cover what the MVVM acronym stands for to begin with. So MVVM stands for Model, View, and View Model, which are the three main fundamental components of this pattern. So to quickly go through them, we have first the model, which represents all the data objects that your app interacts with. So for instance, imagine you have a context list app. So each model could be a person object with properties such as the name, the phone number, and the address. Then you have the view, which is the UI framework dependent layer of your application. So it might be, for instance, WPF or WinUI. And it contains all the controls that on one hand show all these models to the user and present them to them, and also receive all the interactions from the user, such as clicking on buttons, for instance. And then we have the view model, which is this glue layer that sits in between the model and the view. And it has two main responsibilities. So on one hand, it has to load and prepare all this data to then bind that to the UI component so that users can see them. And then at the same time, it also is responsible for receiving all of these interactions from the user and propagating them to the backend code so that it can do things such as querying the database, interacting with web services, and updating the models in any way that your app needs.
Great. And it's really about this separation of concerns, right? Between those different layers of your apps where this pattern really shines, right? And sometimes that's a little fuzzy, like which things should be in which layer. But it's really about separating out that kind of UI specific, what are the buttons? What are they doing? How are they hooking into the logic and the logic itself, right? And that's what we're going to go into today and show why that's important and how we can make sure that we keep ourselves clean in that regard and have that clear separation of those layers. And what that then enables and unlocks for us is that ability to reuse that code, right? We now have this platform agnostic behavior to our application that doesn't depend on the UI layer. And that makes it more testable for us, right? We can go in, we can test just the core logic of our app and separate out where, a problem might be, right? We don't have to hunt and decide, is it something in our UI layer in that view? Or something related to the OS or the platform that we're on versus the actual logic and behavior that we want our application to do. And then that also gives us that benefit if we're working on a team to separate out those concerns, right? You can have someone working on that logic and building out the application and what it's possible for it to do. And then someone looking at the UI and how that's presented and displayed to the user and how users interact with it. And so for this, right, we don't want to do all this work from scratch to get started. We have the MVVM toolkit already, right? Sergio, you built this amazing tool. Tell us about it and how it can help us.
Sure. So the MVVM toolkit is this official MVVM implementation that we offer as part of the .NET Community Toolkit. So for those who are not familiar with it, the .NET Community Toolkit is a set of libraries that can be used by any .NET developers that we published around 3 years ago now. And the MVVM toolkit is one of its components. So you can find it on NuGet. The package is called communitytoolkit.mvvm. And it's part of this community toolkit organization, which encompasses a whole set of other toolkits as well, such as the Windows Community Toolkit, which you might know about. And so the MVVM toolkit in particular is built around a series of core pillars, which we can just get into in general very quickly now. So first of all, it mostly targets both .NET 9 all the way down to .NET Standard 2.0. And the reason for doing this is that we wanted no compromises in terms of using all the latest and greatest new features of modern .NET. But at the same time, we also wanted the toolkit to be usable by as many .NET developers as possible. So this basically gives us the best of both worlds. So if you're on .NET 8 or .NET 9, you get full trim and AOT compatibility, but you can still use the toolkit all the way down to .NET Framework if you're maintaining older code bases, for instance. It's also very simple to pick up and use, and it's a la carte. And what we mean by that is that rather than forcing you to necessarily use an all or nothing approach, or maybe having to structure your app in a specific way with some specific patterns in order to use its features, it instead offers just a series of building blocks that are modular and independent from each other. And so you're free to just pick up and choose whichever one you want to use in your app. And you can then gradually adopt all the features of the MVVM toolkit and then use more of them over time in whichever way works best for your application. It's also meant, as we mentioned, to be a reference implementation of a series of APIs and interfaces that are part of the base class library of .NET, but that don't have an actual implementation there. So a common example of this could be the identify property change interface, which is the base interface that's implemented by all view models, and it's responsible for sending property change notifications so that the UI can monitor changes. That is defined in the base class library, but doesn't actually have an implementation there, which we instead provide here. And lastly, we also feature a whole set of source generators and analyzers. So the idea there being that the analyzers help guide you spot common mistakes and pitfalls and guide you towards writing better code and suggest better patterns whenever applicable. And also all the source generators help write a whole bunch of additional supporting code for MVVM automatically for you behind the scenes. So that essentially allows you to avoid one of the main drawbacks of MVVM per se, which is the fact that it needs a substantial amount of arguably verbose code. Whereas with this, you get all the benefits from MVVM without any of that. You just write very succinct and compact code, and the generators handle writing all of that additional supporting code for you without you even having to look at it.
Right. Like if you're writing I notify property changed implementation again, like just stop. Like you use this instead, right? We have all the hard work's been done for you already here. So that's great. And with that, like let's jump in and start coding and you putting this stuff to practice, right? So what are we going to do today? We're going to take a simple WPF app that we've started here with our UI layer, and we're going to implement the logic in MVVM. And then we're going to show how we can now use that abstracted logic and kind of unit test it if we wanted to set up tests for just our core application logic, business logic per se. And then looking at like if we wanted to now leverage this code on other platforms and other ways, how would we be able to do that? And so we're going to show how we can kind of jump in with a new platform like WinUI and reuse that code and easily hook it up and bootstrap our project there. And so this is our demo. Let's dive in, Sergio, and get started.
Yep.
And so we have a just WPF app here. We have added some code here just for some text and some buttons. So let me boot this up here and we can see what this looks like. But it's just basically a simple counter application, which shows, which we might have seen at like different kind of cases in other .NET talks as well. So we just have a counter and we have a value here with a couple of buttons that we want to be able to click and have increment and decrement this counter. And we can see like nothing kind of happens right now at the moment. So, and we can also see it looked really pretty, right? And I was able to just make use of the new .NET 9 theming for WPF by adding theme mode here. And I was also able to leverage the WinUI nice styles to get that kind of text ramp. So I was able to grab those from the WinUI 3 gallery app and use them here in my WPF app, right? Yeah, it's pretty cool. And we'll point out to the WPF talk later that touched on some of these things the other day. But for now, we have our starting app. Like, where do we want to get started, Sergio? Like, what's our first step?
Yeah, so the first step would be we now have our view and we want to create a associated view model for it with all the properties and commands that we want to then bind to the UI. That would probably be where I would start.
Okay, and so is that something like I'm just going to want to add in my base project here already? Like where does this go?
Right, so you could do that, but then you would, by doing so, you would miss out on some of the main advantages of MVVM. So what I would personally recommend would be to create a separate project just with all your core backend, and then you would put all of your models, view models, and shared services there. And that gives you a whole set of advantages, such as you can have that project not reference WPF at all, for instance, in this case, which makes it much easier to test without any dependencies to the UI framework. It also helps enforce not accidentally using any UI-specific APIs in your view models, which again also helps with testing. And also in case you wanted to later on share this same project with other UI frameworks, you can just easily do that. You just have that project already and you just reference it from different UI backends.
Cool. So yeah, I've just set up this base class library here. And so this just gives us this pure .NET library that we can work with. I'm going to switch this to use the nice file scope namespaces to get us started.
Better.
So much better. And so I'll call this our main view model, right? And I'm going to want this to inherit from observable object, but we don't have this yet, right? This is where the MVVM toolkit comes in, right?
Correct. Yep, we need to add a reference to it.
All right, so I'm just going to go right click on my project, go to manage NuGet packages, and go over to browse, and we can just search for MVVM, and we'll see right here the community toolkit right here at the top. And we're just going to grab the latest version of this, which has all the great .NET 9 support here, and install that. And then we should just be able to do our control dot and get our using here so that we can use this. What does the observable object do for us, Sergio?
So observable object is one of those reference implementations that we talked about earlier, right? So this is the implementation of the unnotified property change interface, which is the core interface for all of our view models. So it both implements that interface and also exposes a whole bunch of helper methods to do things such as setting a property value and raising property change notifications if needed. And crucially, it's also offering support through all of those helper methods for the source generators to hook into to then generate all those properties for us.
And like everything these days, like source generators are becoming really popular, and I've used them a lot in my past. And I know like I have to make this a partial class if I want to make use of source generators, right?
Yeah, that's because all the source generators will generate another partial definition of your class with all the generated members being there. So you need the partial, otherwise the two would collide and would fail to build.
Yeah, I've just started adding it to all my classes now because I know at some point I'm probably going to use source generators, and so it's just easier to get it started. So, but now we can just create our property like we would in any other .NET class here. So I'm going to create a counter. And now I just want to make this partial as well, right? We can leverage this in .NET 9 to have the source generator do stuff for us. We can actually see that it's telling us that we need to actually use the latest language. So we're going to add that to our project here, right?
Yep, we just need to set lang version and set that to preview.
There we go. And so now that squiggle should go away here, and then
it probably doesn't go away until you actually implement.
I was going to say I probably have to build. So before that, I should like add this observable property, which is what's going to tell the MVVM toolkit to do all that magic for us. Correct?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, this is new in the latest 8.4 preview version of the MVVM toolkit. And it was one of the most requested features. Yeah.
I'm really being excited to get the partial properties here for this. It's just going to make navigating through the project a lot easier. And let's talk a little bit about why that is. So if you look underneath this project now in the analyzer section, this is where all the goodness happens. So underneath the MVVM toolkit source generators, we can scroll down here and we can find the observable property generator. And so this is where it's actually putting that code for that property now. And we can see we have the main view model partial class here that it's generated. And this is what's actually creating this property and calling our onProperty changed notification for the iNotify property changed interface, right, Sergio?
Yep, this is doing a whole bunch of additional work for us, like we mentioned. And you can also see that not only is it implementing the property for us, but it's also taking advantage of the fact that because it's all generated code, you don't have to look at it. So it doesn't have to be, it can afford to be verbose. And in exchange for that, it can do a whole set of additional optimizations for us. So for instance, it's generating a set of helper methods that we can hook into if we wanted to also run additional code on property changes. And it's also caching all those property changed event args rather than just creating a new one every single time.
Right.
So we just get all of that for free.
Yeah, it's doing a lot of performance optimization for us, so we don't have to worry about all the hard stuff, and we just get to use basically a simple looking property in our class like we would in many other projects. That's really great. Let me just make sure this builds before we continue there. Yeah, I think we're good. Yeah, cool.
Yeah, just mentioning that you might have noticed that the IntelliSense was showing a red squiggly there. That's probably related to some recent changes that Roslyn did to optimize source generators, where instead of running all the time as you were typing like they used before, as an optimization, they now only run when you actually build or save the file. So if you're using them and you still see some red squiggles, just make sure to like save and build, and things should just then work.
And I think there's the settings thing for that somewhere too.
Yeah, you can customize that. Yeah.
And so now that we have this counter variable, we member, we want to make sure we can have like methods that act on that too, right? So we're going to call have an increment method that's going to add to the counter, and we can use our handy copilot here to help us write our decrement method as well. And we want to expose these to our view layer as well as like commands that it can call easily and hook into our buttons, right? I think there's a helper for that too, right?
Yeah, exactly. So we can use, in this case, the relay command attribute, which triggers another source generator, which instead this time will target the annotated methods, and it will generate the matching command with the right signature and the right type, deriving from the iCommand interface, so that we can then bind to them from our UI layer.
And we can see this generator right here again. We can go in, we can see that there's one for each of our methods. And this is actually creating this actual command interface for us and property that then just calls that method for us automatically. So that's really cool. I love that you can actually just see the generated code in Visual Studio here and just kind of know exactly what's going on.
Yeah, it's very convenient. And you can. There's also an option if you wanted to save those files on disk, so you could also even commit them into your repo if you want to like be 100% sure of everything that's going into the actual final DLL you're consuming. Nothing is hidden.
That's cool. I didn't know that. And that's the other advantage here of now this being a partial property, is that when we kind of try to F12 from somewhere else in our project or from our XAML later, as we'll get into, then it'll take us directly to this property that's defined in our class rather than the generated property that was happened in prior versions of Toolkit.
Exactly. Yeah, that should be much easier to debug now and investigate.
Sweet. So now that we have our commands, we want to add a reference to this to our WPF project. So I can just go into dependencies, add a project reference, make sure I click on our core project. And now we should be able to leverage this within our XAML and hook up our view and our view model, right?
Yep, exactly. We just need to create the view model and then we can bind to it.
Yeah, so I'm going to create a window of resources here, and I'm going to instantiate our view model and give it a key of view model. And we're going to use the light bulb here to make sure we add that namespace so that XAML knows where to find that class. And now we're going to add the data context to our stack panel. So we can use a static resource to grab our view model instance there. So this tells our XAML tree that like this is the class that we want to grab properties from, right? Which is going to be our view model. And we can come into the text now and then use data binding. So we can use binding and we get IntelliSense here. We can see we have access to our counter, right? And this data binding is now going to tell this text property of our text block to go grab the value from our view model. And then the iNotify property change, when we update that property, which all the MVVM toolkit does that magic for us, is going to notify the XAML layer here that, oh, the properties changed, you should update the display of this text field. So it all kind of now just happens automatically without us having to write a whole bunch of glue and try and figure out, where the text block is and update it. Like it's just automatic.
Right. So ideally, we don't even have to touch the code behind that at all.
Right. And we can do the same thing with our commands here too. We just have these well-defined hooks into our system that now can call those methods And so if we run this application, we should be able to see everything working. We pull this over here. And so now we have our counter. And if I click on increment, it goes up. And if decrement, it goes down. So we pretty easily now separated out our application logic and being able to hook it into our UI all pretty quickly. So now that we've separated our logic, what can we do with it, Sergio?
Well, we can leverage one of the main advantages of MVVM for starters, and we can add some unit tests maybe.
Okay,
Just make sure that our view model is actually doing what we expect it to do.
Right. So I can right click on my solution. I can add a new project here and I can just search for MS test, right? I can just grab the blank MS test project here for all .NET libraries and give it a proper name here for our app and call it tests. And I'm just going to create the blank defaults here, right? This gives us a nice new blank test project right here. And use file scope namespaces. Right now I can, I have to add, of course, a project reference to our core library, because that's what we want to add. Yep. And now we can just create a method, right? Like any other .NET class or system, I can just test my increment method. I can instantiate my main view model.
Yeah, we're just testing any normal .NET library. Like we have no reference to WPF at all from here, which is nice.
Exactly, all right. That's the really cool part is we can now do all this testing without having to worry about hooking into clicking on buttons or any of that other UI level stuff. We can just basically just go call our methods as we would in any code and check if they're doing what we expect them to do, right? And we can see we're getting a lot of help here from our GitHub Copilot and just filling in this method here. I'm just going to copy this code because that's actually probably quicker in this case and make this a -1 and test method. So now if we run these, we should just be able to test our code without even having to worry about...
I think you might want to change the second method to decrement though, the test.
Ah, yes, that would be good. Good call it. This is the advantage of pure programming and how we know it's real code. Yeah, we saw the test fail. Good call it, Sergio. But yeah, now we've been able to test all these test methods without even having to worry about, clicking on a UI button or different frameworks or whatever. We can just kind of test this core logic of our app. And that's the advantage that I really find of this pattern and separating things out is now we can strictly determine, is this a problem within the UI layer or is this a problem within our app's logic, right? I find 80-90% of the time, it's a problem in my logic, right? I can add another test case. I can see it failing. I can go fix the issue and do all that just in pure .NET space. And then suddenly my UI starts working because there's an issue in my logic, right? Not in my UI.
Yeah, I can save you so much time investigating bugs.
Right. Awesome. So, right, we've got our whole application here. Are we done? What else can we do with this pattern?
Well, why not try to leverage the fact that all of our backend is decoupled now and try porting the entire app to WinUI 3.
Right. Yeah. Maybe we've got a Maui app or some other app and we want to target web with Blazor, right? Or in this case for WPF, we want to go check out WinUI. Now that it's all decoupled, this seems really simple. Let's just go add a WinUI project and go from there. I just select the blank app packaged. I got this just by having the new WinUI workload that we shipped at build earlier this year. So I'm just going to call this WinUI, use the blank settings. I've got my WinUI app here. Again, I'm just going to go into dependencies, add that core project reference, right? Everything now is just sharing all our base code. And let's just bootstrap our project here with our XAML from WPF, right? And so now I can go into my main window for WinUI, and I'll paste this in here as well. And let's go into, you notice I didn't copy the resource. We can actually now use the main view model from our code behind. I'm going to get rid of the template code there. And so we can instantiate our view model. I'll call it view model. I'll make it a public property. And so the advantage of us being able to do this in code behind now is if we wanted to call on dependency injection and do services and kind of hydrate this with other services, we can just kind of do that from our code behind here, right, Sergio?
Yeah, that's one thing that we usually do is we use data binding for everything, but of course, like you can only instantiate the view model directly in XAML if it has no dependencies. So if instead you do, from here, you can easily just get the service provider for your app and then just create an instance of your view model, which is effectively a service, and that will use all dependency injection and grab all the dependencies that it needs, and then you can just bind it to the UI through this view model property.
Yeah. One thing I'll call out here too in WinUI, window isn't a framework element. So if you need access to certain things on that, you should like create a page. But other than that, I don't think we need to worry about it in this case. So now I can actually get rid of my data context from my stack panel here, and we want to change to theme resource over dynamic resource. But I can use the same styles, right? Because these were the WinUI styles that we were leveraging from the WPF update.
Right.
And now we're just in WinUI land, so we can use them directly. And now we can switch to Xbind, right? So what's the advantage of Xbind over binding, Sergio?
All right, so Xbind is this new version of binding that's been around for a few years. And the main advantage is that it's entirely compile time based. So it doesn't use any kind of reflection, which makes it both better in terms of like the IntelliSense support that you get, the fact that you get to also, you can invoke instance methods, you can call even static members if you want to. But most importantly, it also makes the entire binding completely trim and AOT safe, which especially if you want to run your app on native AOT, it's very important.
Right. And we can see I got IntelliSense there. Now I can just reference my view model directly to call these properties and commands. And then we've also, by default, Xbind is one time. So we want to change our mode equal to one way here so that the counter will get notified and update itself when we run this. And I can just change my startup project here to WinUI. And hopefully, knock on wood, we should be all good to go.
Ship it.
Yeah. And bring the application over here.
Nice.
Shrink it down. And so now we have our WinUI app and we have our counter and everything is just working just as it did in our other application. We're done.
Very nice. Yeah, it took like 30 seconds to just forward the XAML. Everything else was the same. So nice.
Yeah. No, it's really great to have that flexibility to know that your application logic is solid and tested. And, now that we can just re-leverage it, try out a new framework or migrate to some other framework if we need to, like we have that flexibility, and decoupling so much of our code from that means that we just have to worry about that one small part and the implementation details there. And, as we showed here between WPF and WinUI, it was pretty easy for us to at least copy some basic XAML in and get that migrated over pretty easily. So if you want to know more about WinUI and WPF, there's been a couple of great talks this week at .NET Conf, so I encourage you to check them out. The What's New in WinUI and Windows App SDK talk goes into a little bit more detail about how to get started with native IoT, as Sergio called out as a good advantage of being able to use Xbind in WinUI. And WPF talks about the theming stuff that we talked about a little bit and kind of what they're doing in this space and what they're thinking about as the road ahead. And if you want to get started with MVVM, we have the link to the docs and the sample app here. And again, more WinUI and WPF links. I think that's everything, Sergio. This has been really great. Thanks for your help here today.
Yeah, of course. So fun.
So be sure to get the .NET 9 here. And thanks so much for your time today. We really appreciate being here at .NET Conf, and enjoy your day.
Thanks, everyone.